like and subscribe, pretty please. Redditors who lived in countries that no longer exist, like Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, etc. What was it like to see your country break up? When Czechoslovakia separated into Czech Republic and Slovak Republic, I was quite young and had no idea what was going on. Then suddenly, they started teaching us slightly different geography at school. But apart from that, and a few bitter remarks from some adults, that was all. What I do remember though, is that almost all the textbooks we got in school were written in the time of Czechoslovakia, and no one bothered to change them for up-to-date versions, so we were often asked to cross out Czechoslovakia from the text and write Czech Republic above it. Or draw a thick line between Czech and Slovak republics on a map. That was during the first 9 years of school, at least. Otherwise, I think Czechs and Slovaks have still quite the brotherly relationship. For example, there is a huge amount of Slovak students in Czech universities who later stay to work. My parents lived in Bosnia before the Yugoslavian war. They finished building their family home for them and my siblings who were babies back then, in 1988 or 1989. And now, imagine being forced to move away from your newly built life with 2 young children a year later. I was born in Austria in 1992, and I remember being poor as a child, poor but happy. My mother's educational degrees were not to be found / were not accepted in Austria, basically restricting her possible jobs to being a cleaning lady after being the manager of a Yugoslavian market chain. I remember the first time we visited the old house after the war in 1998, I think. I remember seeing the house full of bullet holes, one corner of the house blown away by tank grenades. I remember finding my brother's old toys trampled into the dirt in the front yard. I remember my mother finding an old dress of hers in their former bedroom, hardened by the exposure to the element. I vividly remember her sitting on the stairs in front of the main entrance, silently crying. My point is, it is often not so much about seeing your country break apart, but much rather about seeing the life, dreams, and hopes you left behind rot like the old green velvet dress she loved so much. I was born at the end of the Bosnian War, 1995, following the breakup of Yugoslavia, circa 1992, so I can't remember the breakup, but I remember the post-breakup / post-war years. Having very little money, the city, Sarajevo, was bombed to shit, and 95% of buildings either had bullet holes or were torn down. I remember watching German channels like Togo and all the cool toys the German kids had that you couldn't buy in my country at the time. My dad drove a Yugo 55, Google it. The bodywork on that car was full of shrapnel holes. He replaced the engine. Later, my dad did the bodywork on the car himself, but he didn't have money for car paint, so he painted it with paint used for mailboxes. No supermarkets, only small stores and markets. Now the country looks and feels like any other European country, but back then it was a whole different story. Also, another thing that pops into my head from my childhood is all the mines. The country was heavily mined around where the front lines used to be, so you couldn't just walk around freely in the forests, because you could step on a mine. If you wanted to go out into nature, you had these exact places where you could go, where battles weren't fought, because there were no mines there. There were also ads on TV, teaching children not to pick up any objects they find, and not to wander off into the forest, or go into abandoned buildings, because of the mines. And we had these demining teams come to our schools to show us what mines and bombs look like. You would be surprised to see all the things that could be made into a bomb. Pens, stuffed toy bears, etc. I was in Sarajevo from 2001 to 2003. I remember driving by pastures with cows one day, and then the next day, there would be pieces of a dead cow in the middle of the field, and mine tape all the way around it. I thought that Bosnia had a lot of natural beauty, and Sarajevo was once a beautiful city. It was sad being there during those times. I'm happy that it is making a comeback and is being rebuilt. Well, Czechoslovakia divided into Czech and Slovak Republic, and honestly it's pretty much the same. The languages are almost identical, and there is pretty much no difference between the two countries, except for the fact that Czechia is bigger and has a little bit better economy. I had a foreign exchange student from Latvia. He said his family made a lot of money because they sold a tank left on their property. I lived in Moscow before the USSR got dissolved. One thing that was jarring in the aftermath was the emergence of a lot of Western chains we previously had no exposure to. I remember going to my first McDonald's in 1991. A funny anecdote I heard is that the service staff had to be trained to act more friendly, like they would in American restaurants. To be fair, it was a stressful and uncertain period. We emigrated from the USSR about a year before it broke up, so technically I'm a Soviet. What makes everything more complicated is that we are from Crimea, which was recently annexed by Russia. I opened a new bank account a while back, and one of the details I had to fill is where I'm originally from. It was an electronic form with a menu. No option to select USSR, and pick either Ukraine or Russia would be taking a political standpoint. It was a very weird experience. I was born in Yugoslavia, mid-80s. It was sad. I lived in a major city, largely UN touched by direct attack, but we had all three major ethnicities heavily represented, and it was incredibly confusing as to why friends stopped being friends, families broke up, etc. As kids we understood what was happening, but not why. I remember hiding my next door Muslim neighbor when the military police came. I remember being embarrassed of who I was, even though my family lineage has mixed roots. I remember weeks without electricity, without running water. Doing homework by candlelight. Military rations. One bottle of oil to last months. Flour was scarce. The river would carry sounds of gunfire and explosions. I saw my dad only a few times in 5 years. Afterwards I remember thinking that was lucky, some didn't see their dads at all. I remember my dad spending what little time he had at home teaching me how to use various guns, just in case. Afterwards, some people lost their minds. One of the soldiers was convinced the enemy was still there, ever present. He would place small explosives that looked like canned food in the cupboards where his wife and kids were, in his mind to protect them. A couple drank themselves to death. I always believed they died in the forest outside the town years ago. Businesses closed, factories were empty. There was still work for some, but no pay. The currency was worthless. You'd get paid sometimes, in the morning, and by the afternoon it wasn't even enough for a roll of toilet paper. Weird scary times. Air raid sirens would interrupt soccer games. I remember wondering why I couldn't see some of my friends. Explanations back then didn't make sense. They still don't. For the people that lived, worked, and played together, we never wanted that shit. It was pushed on us, manipulated us, played to our fears and insecurities. Maybe it would have happened eventually regardless. I was born in the USSR, 2 months before it collapsed, so I don't personally remember anything, but my parents do. Everything was basically chaos. Most of the businesses that were previously funded by the government had no chance of competing with Western businesses, so many of them went bankrupt, and that meant that lots of people, including my father, lost their jobs. And lots of unemployment then led to lots of crime. The 90s were a crazy time, full of riots, crimes, and violence in many former Soviet countries. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe.